Walter exhaled slowly. Not fully, just enough to settle the movement within his chest. And then his finger moved. Not abruptly, not with force, but with a quiet certainty that carried no hesitation. And the shot followed, clean and controlled, the sound traveling across the range before anyone had time to react. And then there was a pause, a fraction of a second that felt longer than it should, before the distant steel answered with a clear, unmistakable ring. No one spoke, because the sound did not fit the pattern they had come to expect. You ever seen a man miss 5 times in a row, and still think he understands the wind? The voice came low and steady, cutting through the dry afternoon air like a blade that didn't need sharpening. But no one laughed. Not yet. Because Lieutenant Jason Mercer was still smiling, and his smile carried rank, authority, and the kind of confidence that came from never being proven wrong in front of his men. The range stretched wide under a pale sky, heat shimmering just above the cracked dirt, flags snapping in uneven rhythms along the firing line, each one telling a slightly different story that only a few even thought to read. And behind the line stood Walter Boone, a man most of them had already dismissed without a second thought. His jacket worn thin at the elbows, boots dusted with the same earth they trained on, his posture relaxed in a way that didn't match the tension humming through the rest of the unit. Mercer paced slowly in front of the assembled Marines, boots grinding against gravel, the sharp crunch echoing in the silence that followed each failed shot. One after another. The distant steel plate untouched at 1,500 yards, a target so small it seemed like a suggestion more than an objective. And every miss tightened the air just a little more, pride beginning to crack beneath the surface of polished gear and calibrated optics. State-of-the-art equipment, Mercer said, loud enough for everyone to hear, gesturing toward the rifles, the scopes, the handheld weather meters blinking with data. And somehow, we're still guessing. A few chuckles followed, thin and forced, because no one wanted to be the one he was really talking about. And then his gaze shifted, landing on Walter like a spotlight snapping into place. Deliberate. Calculated. A shift in focus that changed the entire temperature of the moment. Or maybe, Mercer continued, voice dipping just enough to carry something sharper beneath it, we just need fresh eyes. The sarcasm wasn't hidden, it was displayed, polished like a badge. And a couple of younger Marines turned, finally giving the old man their full attention, seeing him not as background noise, but as something closer to a problem that needed solving. Walter didn't move. Didn't react. His eyes tracing the horizon instead of the lieutenant, watching the way the heat bent the air, the way the flags disagreed with each other, the way the land itself whispered corrections that no device could quite translate. Mercer took a few steps closer, closing the distance until the difference between them felt measured. Intentional. You lost, sir, he asked. The word, sir, stripped of any real respect, reshaped into something else entirely, something lighter, almost dismissive. And a ripple of quiet amusement passed through the line, subtle but present, because now the moment had shifted from training to spectacle. Walter finally looked at him. Not up, not down, just level. Eyes clear and unreadable. The kind of gaze that didn't challenge, but didn't yield either. And for a fraction of a second, something in Mercer's expression hesitated. Just a flicker. Gone as quickly as it came, replaced again by that practiced certainty. This is a restricted range, Mercer added, slower now, each word placed carefully. And we don't run open auditions. A few of the Marines laughed this time, more confidently, encouraged by the tone, by the permission embedded in it. And the sound carried across the dry air, bouncing off the stillness like something out of place. Walter shifted his weight slightly, boots settling into the dirt with a soft, almost inaudible press. And when he spoke, his voice didn't rise to meet the laughter. Didn't compete with it. It simply existed beneath it, steady, grounded, impossible to ignore once heard. You're reading one wind, he said. Eyes drifting briefly toward the flags, then back to the distant steel. There are 3. The words hung there, quiet and unadorned. And for a moment, no one reacted. Because they didn't know how to. Because it didn't sound like a joke, and it didn't sound like a guess either. And that was the problem. Mercer exhaled through his nose, a short, controlled breath that carried just enough disbelief to reset the mood, to pull it back into his control. 3 wins, he repeated, shaking his head slightly as if indulging something harmless. That's what we're going with. The laughter returned. Louder now. Easier. The tension dissolving just enough for pride to reassert itself. But Walter had already looked away again, already listening to something else, something none of them could hear yet. And somewhere beyond the line, the steel target waited. Silent. Untouched. As if it already knew what was coming. The laughter did not last long, because failure has a way of lingering in the air longer than any joke. And the next Marine stepped back to the firing line with a tighter grip than before, jaw clenched, shoulders squared, as if determination alone could bend distance and physics into obedience. The rifles settled into position, bipod digging into the dirt, scope aligned with the distant shimmer where the steel plate stood barely visible. And the spotter beside him adjusted his lens, calling out numbers that sounded precise, but felt uncertain. Wind speed. Direction. Elevation. All measured. All calculated. Yet somehow, still incomplete. A breath held. Then released. A trigger pressed with care. And a fraction of a second later, the sound came back empty. No sharp ring of impact, only the dull echo of another miss absorbed by the open range. And this time, no one laughed. Not even Mercer. Because the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. One after another they cycled through. Each Marine stepping up with the same tools. The same data. The same growing frustration. Until the air itself felt heavier, as if the silence between shots had gained weight, pressing down on every calculation they trusted. Mercer folded his arms, watching, his earlier confidence thinning at the edges but not yet gone, not willing to give ground in front of his unit. And when the last shooter stepped away with the same result, he exhaled slowly, a controlled release that carried more irritation than he would admit. His eyes shifted again, drawn back to Walter as if the man had been standing there the entire time waiting for this exact moment. Unmoved by the failures. Untouched by the tension. His gaze still fixed somewhere beyond the obvious. Somewhere past the steel, past the numbers, into the patterns no one else seemed to notice. You see something we do not? Mercer asked, tone sharper now. Not quite mocking, not quite respectful. Something in between that betrayed a crack in his certainty. Walter did not answer immediately. And the pause stretched just long enough to make the question feel heavier than intended. The kind of silence that forces attention without demanding it. And when he finally spoke, his voice remained the same. Low and even. The wind on the ground, is not the wind halfway there, he said, eyes tracking the faint distortion rising off the sun-baked terrain. And halfway there, is not what it is at the target. A few Marines exchanged glances, uncertain whether to dismiss it or consider it. Because it sounded simple, but it did not feel simple. Mercer let out a short breath, shaking his head slightly as if clearing it. We have instruments for that, he replied, gesturing toward the devices clipped to belts and mounted on rifles, small screens glowing with confidence. We do not guess out here. And yet the word guess hung there. Uncomfortable. Because that was exactly what it had started to feel like. Walter took a slow step forward. Not toward Mercer, but toward the line. Boots pressing into the dirt with quiet certainty. And the movement alone shifted the attention of everyone present, drawing their focus without a word, without permission, as if something in his presence carried its own authority. Mercer watched him closely now. No longer amused. No longer dismissive. Something sharper settling into his posture. This is not a demonstration, he said, voice firm, reclaiming control. You are not part of this exercise. But the words lacked the earlier ease, lacked the confidence that had come so naturally before. Walter stopped just short of the firing position, looking down at the rifle resting on the mat, then out again toward the distant steel, measuring something unseen, something unspoken. And for a brief moment, the range itself seemed to quiet. The flag still snapping. The heat still rising. But the noise of doubt and pride and expectation fading just enough to reveal the space beneath it. "You are chasing what the tools tell you," Walter said, almost to himself, though everyone heard it. "Not what the land is doing." And this time, no one laughed at all, because the words did not sound like a challenge. They sounded like an answer, and that was far more unsettling. Mercer held his ground for a moment longer, as if the space between authority and uncertainty could still be controlled by posture alone. But the weight of the silence had shifted, and it was no longer his to command. The Marines were watching now. Not just observing, but measuring. Their attention no longer fixed on rank or protocol, but on the quiet man standing just off the line. And that change, subtle as it was, did not go unnoticed. Mercer stepped forward, closing the gap with deliberate precision, boots pressing harder into the gravel this time, each step louder than necessary, as if sound itself could reassert control over the moment. "You are speaking like this is theory," he said, voice steady but edged. "But this range runs on precision. Not instinct." And the word instinct carried a quiet dismissal, a suggestion that what Walter offered belonged to something outdated. Something unreliable. Walter did not turn to face him immediately. His eyes still following the invisible currents moving across the field, tracing the faint distortions that rose and fell with the heat. And when he finally spoke, it was not to argue. Not to challenge. But to clarify. "Precision without understanding is still guessing," he said. And the words settled differently this time. Heavier. Harder to ignore. Because they did not contradict the system, they exposed its limits. Mercer's jaw tightened, a brief flicker of frustration breaking through the composed exterior he had maintained. And he glanced back at his unit, aware now that every second of hesitation was being recorded in ways no report would ever capture. And that awareness pushed him forward, forcing a decision. "All right," he said, tone sharpening into something decisive, something that sounded like control even if it was not. "You think you can read it better, then show me." The challenge was no longer wrapped in humor. No longer softened by sarcasm. It was direct. Clean. And impossible to ignore. And a ripple moved through the Marines. Not laughter this time, but anticipation. The kind that builds when something unexpected is about to happen. Walter looked down at the rifle again. The metal catching a thin line of sunlight. The scope reflecting a faint glare. And for a moment his hand hovered just above it, not touching, not claiming, simply acknowledging, as if the object itself carried a memory he was choosing whether to revisit. The air shifted slightly. A new gust brushing across the range. The flags snapping in uneven sequence, one pulling left, another holding steady, a third lagging behind. And Walter's eyes tracked each one without hurry, without strain, absorbing the pattern as naturally as breathing. Mercer stepped back, giving space, though the movement felt less like permission and more like containment, as if he were setting the boundaries of what was about to unfold. 5 shots, he said, voice firm, echoing the earlier claim. "That is what you said." And the number hung there. Simple. Defined. A standard that could not be softened or reinterpreted. Walter nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible motion. And then he moved. Stepping onto the mat with a calm that did not match the tension surrounding him. Lowering himself into position with practiced ease. Not rushed. Not hesitant. Every movement deliberate. Efficient. As if time itself had slowed to match his pace. The Marines leaned in slightly, unconsciously, their focus narrowing, drawn to the stillness rather than the action. Because there was no excess in what he did. No adjustment made for appearance. No gesture meant to impress. Only the quiet alignment of body, rifle, and distance. Mercer watched closely now. Arms no longer crossed. Hands resting at his sides. His earlier confidence replaced by something sharper, more attentive. Because whatever this was, it had moved beyond a simple challenge. Beyond a moment of control. And into something else entirely, something he could not yet define. Walter settled behind the rifle. Cheek resting lightly against the stock. Eyes looking through the scope. But not searching. Not scanning. Simply seeing. And the range, wide and open and unforgiving, seemed to draw in around that single point of focus, as if everything else had stepped back to make room for what was about to happen. The world narrowed to the length of the rifle and the distance beyond it, everything else fading into a quiet that did not belong to the range, but to something older. Something practiced long before any of them had ever touched a scope. Walter's breathing settled into a rhythm so subtle it was almost invisible. A slow rise and fall that matched neither the tension of the Marines nor the restless movement of the wind flags. And for a moment, it seemed as if he was not preparing to shoot at all, but simply listening. Reading the space between movement and stillness. Mercer shifted his stance slightly, watching for adjustments that never came. No dialing of turrets. No recalibration of data. No glance at the handheld instruments that had guided every attempt before this. And the absence of those steps felt wrong. Incomplete. Like watching someone skip essential parts of a process everyone else relied on. The spotter beside the line raised his scope. Instinct taking over. But even he hesitated, unsure what he was supposed to call out. Because the usual language of corrections and measurements did not seem to apply to what he was seeing. Walter's finger rested along the side of the rifle. Not yet on the trigger. His gaze steady through the glass, tracking something that shifted in layers. Not in a single direction, but in overlapping currents. The heat rising in thin waves. The distant brush bending in patterns too subtle for most to notice. The flags along the line arguing with each other in quiet defiance. A faint breeze crossed from right to left. Then softened. Then reversed just enough to confuse the eye. And a few Marines instinctively glanced at their devices, watching numbers update, watching certainty try to reassert itself. But Walter did not look away. Did not need confirmation. Because whatever he was reading was not displayed on a screen. Mercer cleared his throat softly, a reflex more than a command, as if the silence had stretched too far and needed to be broken. But he did not speak. Because something in the moment resisted interruption, something that made even him hold back. Walter exhaled slowly. Not fully, just enough to settle the movement within his chest. And then his finger moved. Not abruptly, not with force, but with a quiet certainty that carried no hesitation. And the shot followed. Clean and controlled. The sound traveling across the range before anyone had time to react. And then there was a pause, a fraction of a second that felt longer than it should, before the distant steel answered with a clear, unmistakable ring. No one spoke. Because the sound did not fit the pattern they had come to expect. It did not match the sequence of misses that had defined the afternoon. And for a moment it seemed like an anomaly. A single exception that could still be explained away. Walter did not lift his head. Did not acknowledge the result. His focus already settled back into the space beyond the scope, as if the first shot had been nothing more than confirmation, not achievement. The wind shifted again. Subtle but present. And without adjusting the rifle, without changing position, he moved his finger once more. Another controlled press. Another release. And again, the sound returned. Sharp and precise. Echoing back from the distant target with the same clarity as before. This time the silence broke differently. Not with laughter. Not with doubt. But with something quieter. Something closer to disbelief, as the Marines looked from the target back to the man on the line, trying to reconcile what they were seeing with what they thought they understood. Mercer's posture changed. Not dramatically, but enough to be noticed. His weight shifting forward slightly. His attention narrowing in a way it had not before. Because whatever this was, it was no longer a demonstration of luck. No longer something that could be dismissed as chance. And the range, wide and open and unforgiving, seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if the pattern would continue. The second impact had not fully faded when the realization began to spread. Slow at first. Like a ripple that no one wanted to acknowledge. Because accepting it meant admitting that everything they trusted had just been challenged without effort. Walter remained exactly where he was. Steady behind the rifle. His breathing unchanged. His posture untouched by the growing tension around him. And the stillness itself became the most unsettling part, because it suggested control, not luck. Intention, not accident. A third shift in the wind moved across the range. Subtle enough that only the flags hinted at it, one snapping sharply to the left while another lagged behind, twisting in delayed response. And the heat rising from the ground distorted the view just enough to mislead anyone relying on sight alone. But Walter's gaze did not waver. His focus fixed beyond the obvious. Beyond the visible. As if he were tracking something layered beneath the surface. Mercer took a step closer without realizing it, drawn in by the need to see, to understand. His earlier authority replaced by a sharper, more urgent attention. And he glanced briefly at the spotter, who said nothing. Because there was nothing to correct. Nothing to adjust. The usual language of guidance stripped away by the simplicity of what was happening. Walter's finger moved again. The motion almost imperceptible. And the third shot broke the silence with the same calm precision, followed once more by that distant, unmistakable ring. Clean and exact. And this time there was no delay in the reaction, no hesitation in recognition. Because 3 in a row could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. A low murmur moved through the Marines. Not loud enough to disrupt the moment, but enough to signal a shift. A quiet acknowledgement that something outside their expectations was unfolding right in front of them. Walter did not react. Did not look back. Did not claim the result. His attention already settling into the next breath, the next alignment. As if the sequence had been decided long before the first shot was ever taken. Mercer's jaw tightened again. But this time it was not frustration, it was calculation. A rapid reassessment of everything he thought he understood about control. About skill. About the limits of experience. And he found no immediate answer. No simple explanation that could restore the balance he had held just moments before. The fourth shot came without warning. Following the same quiet rhythm. The same controlled release. And again, the steel responded. Sharp and undeniable. The sound carrying back across the open distance like a statement that needed no interpretation. Now the silence deepened. Not empty, but full. Charged with the weight of recognition. Because what they were witnessing had moved beyond skill into something closer to mastery. Something that did not rely on demonstration or approval. A few Marines lowered their equipment without realizing it, their attention no longer on their own performance, but entirely on the man at the line. And even the flags seemed to matter less now. Their movements no longer confusing, no longer conflicting, but simply part of a pattern that had already been understood. Mercer stood still. No longer stepping forward. No longer asserting presence. His role in the moment reduced to observation, because whatever authority he carried could not influence what was happening here. And that realization settled heavily, quietly, without resistance. Walter exhaled once more. The same measured release. And the range itself seemed to pause with him. The wind easing just enough. The heat shimmering just slightly less. As if everything had aligned for a final confirmation. And when his finger moved for the 5th time, it carried no urgency. No tension. Only completion. The final shot followed, precise and unbroken. And the distant steel answered once again. Clear and certain. Sealing the sequence in a way that left no room for doubt. No space for dismissal. Only the quiet, undeniable truth of what had just been done. The final echo had not yet faded when the range fell into a silence so complete it felt deliberate, as if every sound had been pulled back and held just out of reach, leaving only the memory of what had just happened to settle into place. No one moved at first. Not the Marines. Not the spotter. Not even Mercer, whose presence had once filled the space with command but now stood still within it, recalibrating without knowing how. Walter remained behind the rifle for a moment longer. Not in celebration. Not in acknowledgement. But in completion. As if the sequence required no reaction, no confirmation beyond what had already been done. And then slowly, without urgency, he lifted his head, his eyes leaving the scope and returning to the world around him with the same quiet clarity he had carried from the beginning. The rifle rested where it was. Unchanged. Untouched by any adjustment. And that absence of correction lingered in the minds of those watching. Because it suggested something they were not trained to measure. Something that existed outside the systems they relied on. A faint breeze moved across the range again. Softer now. The flags responding with less urgency, their earlier disagreements settling into a pattern that felt almost predictable in hindsight. And a few Marines glanced at them as if seeing them for the first time. Not as indicators to be read in isolation, but as parts of a larger conversation they had not yet learned to hear. Mercer stepped forward at last, the motion slower than before, more deliberate. His boots pressing into the gravel with a sound that seemed louder in the quiet. And he stopped just short of the firing line, his gaze fixed on Walter, searching for something that would restore the balance he had lost. A detail. A flaw. Anything that could be explained. But there was nothing offered. Nothing presented for interpretation. Walter rose from the mat with the same economy of movement he had shown throughout. No wasted motion. No display. And as he stood, he brushed a thin layer of dust from his sleeve, a small, ordinary gesture that felt strangely out of place after what had just occurred, because it returned him to something simple, something unremarkable. And that contrast unsettled more than the shots themselves. Mercer opened his mouth as if to speak, then paused. The words not forming as easily as they once had. And for a brief moment the rank on his collar seemed less relevant than the question in his expression, a quiet acknowledgement that authority did not always carry understanding. The spotter finally lowered his scope completely, shaking his head once. Not in disbelief, but in recognition. As if he had just witnessed something that could not be taught in a manual, something that had to be carried. Learned over time. Shaped by experience rather than instruction. One of the younger Marines shifted his weight, glancing from Walter to the distant target and back again. His earlier confidence replaced by a kind of respect that had not been there before. Not given, but earned in a way that required no explanation. Walter picked up the rifle carefully. Not possessively, but with familiarity. And he held it for a moment as if considering it. Then placed it back down exactly where it had been, leaving it as he found it, as if the tool itself had never been the point. Mercer finally spoke, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier edge. "Where did you learn that?" he asked. And the question carried more than curiosity. It carried a shift. A recognition that what he had witnessed belonged to something deeper than training. Walter looked at him briefly, his expression unchanged. And then his gaze moved past him, back toward the open range. The wind. The distance. The space that had revealed itself piece by piece. And when he answered, his voice remained steady. "I learned to listen," he said. And nothing more. And in that moment, the range did not feel like a place of instruction anymore, but a place where something had been remembered. The words did not echo, but they stayed, settling into the space with a weight that no command could override. And for a long moment no one responded. Not because they did not understand, but because they understood just enough to know there was more beneath it than could be explained. Mercer stood there, eyes fixed on Walter, replaying every second in his mind. Every shot, every movement, every decision that had not looked like a decision at all. And for the first time since stepping onto the range that day, he did not feel ahead of the situation. He felt behind it. The Marines shifted subtly, their formation loosening. Not out of discipline but out of attention. Because something had changed in how they were looking, not just at Walter, but at everything around them. The flags. The heat. The terrain. Elements they had treated as variables now appearing as something closer to language. Lance Corporal Devon Shaw lowered his spotting scope slowly, his brow furrowed. Not in confusion, but in recognition. Because what Walter had done did not contradict what they had been taught. It expanded it. Stretched it beyond the boundaries of equipment and instruction. And that realization settled deeper than any correction ever had. Mercer finally exhaled, a longer breath this time, the kind that carried the end of resistance with it. And he took one more step forward, closing the last bit of distance. Not as a challenge. Not as a command. But as acknowledgement. And when he spoke again, his voice had changed, the sharp edge replaced by something steadier. "You saw all of that before you even touched the rifle," he said. Not as a question, but as a conclusion he was still trying to accept. Walter looked at him briefly, then back toward the open field, where the wind moved quietly across the distance. "It was already there," he replied. Simple. Direct. Leaving no space for argument. Mercer nodded once. A small motion, but it carried more weight than any order he had given that afternoon. Because it marked a shift. Not in authority, but in understanding. And behind him, the Marines were watching closely. Not because they were told to, but because they needed to. Because moments like this did not come often. And when they did, they rewrote something fundamental. Devon stepped forward slightly, hesitating just enough to show respect. "Sir," he said, addressing Walter without thinking. The word coming naturally now, stripped of earlier assumptions. "How do you start? Seeing it like that?" And the question carried more than curiosity. It carried intent. The beginning of learning. Walter turned his head just enough to meet his gaze. And for a moment there was something different in his expression. Not pride. Not superiority. But something quieter. Something closer to recognition. "You stop trying to control it," he said. "And you start paying attention to what it is already doing." And again, the answer did not feel like instruction. It felt like a door being opened. Mercer glanced at the rifle on the mat, then back at the distant target, then finally at his Marines. And something in his posture settled. Not lowered, but grounded. As if the weight of command had shifted into something more deliberate, more aware. And he spoke again. This time not to Walter, but to the unit. "Reset the line," he said. Voice steady, but different now. "And this time, do not just read the numbers. Read the space." And the words carried forward. Not as correction, but as direction shaped by something new. The Marines moved quickly, but their energy had changed. No longer rushed. No longer driven by frustration. But by focus. By the quiet understanding that they had just witnessed something rare. Something that could not be ignored. And as they returned to position, adjusting their stance, their grip, their attention, the range itself seemed different. Not because it had changed, but because they had. And Walter remained where he was. Silent once more. Not needing to instruct further. Because what needed to be learned, had already begun. The line reset with a different kind of energy. Not louder, not faster, but sharper. As if each Marine had stepped into position carrying more than just equipment. Carrying the weight of what they had just seen. And the range itself seemed to respond. Not by changing, but by revealing more. The wind no longer a single direction to be measured, but a layered movement to be understood. Devon settled behind his rifle again. Slower this time. His movements deliberate, his breathing steadier. And instead of reaching immediately for the numbers on his device, his eyes lifted, scanning the space between him and the distant steel, tracing the faint shimmer of heat rising off the ground, watching how it bent and shifted in uneven waves. And for the first time, he noticed how the flags did not agree. How one leaned while another hesitated. How the pattern was not a contradiction, but a conversation. Beside him, another Marine adjusted his position. Lowering his scope slightly. Not to change the shot, but to see more. To widen his awareness. And the subtle shift spread down the line. One by one. Small corrections replacing rigid routines. Attention replacing assumption. Mercer stood just behind them now. Silent. Observing. His role no longer to correct immediately, but to allow the moment to develop. To see if what had been shown could take root without being forced. And there was a restraint in that silence, a discipline that had not been there before. Walter remained off to the side, hands resting loosely at his sides. His presence quiet but unmistakable. Not guiding, not intervening. Simply there. And that stillness carried its own influence, shaping the space without effort. Devon exhaled slowly, not rushing into the shot. Letting the rhythm settle. And when his finger moved, it did so with less tension. Less urgency. And the shot broke clean, traveling across the distance. And a moment later, the steel responded. Not perfectly centered, but struck. And the sound carried back with a tone that was unmistakably different from before. Devon did not react immediately. His eyes still on the scope. Absorbing the result. Understanding it rather than celebrating it. And beside him, another Marine followed, adjusting not just his aim, but his perception. And when his shot landed, closer than any he had achieved earlier, a quiet shift moved through the group. Not excitement, but recognition. Mercer nodded once, almost to himself, watching the change unfold. Seeing the difference not in the equipment, not in the conditions, but in the approach. And that realization settled deeper than any correction he could have given. The wind moved again. Subtle but present. And this time the Marines did not rush to compensate. They watched. They waited. They allowed the pattern to reveal itself. Before acting. And the line began to find a rhythm that had been missing before. Not perfect. Not flawless. But grounded in something more reliable than numbers alone. Walter glanced briefly toward the target, then back to the line. His expression unchanged. But there was a quiet acknowledgement in the way he observed them. As if he recognized the shift not as an achievement, but as a beginning. Mercer stepped forward slightly. His voice low but clear. "Hold that," he said. Not as an order to stop. But as a direction to maintain. To stay within the awareness they had found. And the Marines responded without hesitation. Not because of rank, but because the instruction aligned with what they were experiencing. Another shot rang out. Then another. Each one carrying less strain, more intention. And while not every round struck the steel, the misses were different now. Closer. More informed. Each one part of a process rather than a failure. And the range, wide and open under the fading afternoon light, no longer felt like an obstacle to overcome. But a space to understand. And in that shift, something quiet and lasting began to take hold. The light had begun to soften across the range. The harsh edge of the afternoon easing into something calmer. Something quieter. And the long shadows stretched just enough to change how the ground looked. How the heat moved. How the distance felt. And for the Marines on the line, that change no longer felt like an obstacle. It felt like information. The rhythm they had found continued. Steady and deliberate. Each shot placed with more awareness than before. Each breath measured not against urgency, but against understanding. And the steel at 1,500 yards answered more often now. Not perfectly. Not consistently. But enough to confirm that something fundamental had shifted. Mercer stood behind them. Hands resting loosely at his sides. Watching without interruption. His presence no longer pressing forward, but supporting from behind. And there was a quiet clarity in his expression, the kind that comes when certainty is replaced by something more grounded. Something earned rather than assumed. Devon adjusted slightly. His eyes. Tracking the flags again. Then the shimmer of heat. Then the distant brush that moved just enough to reveal a pattern. And when he took his next shot, the result came back clean. The sound of steel carrying across the range with a tone that felt earned rather than hoped for. And this time, he allowed himself a small breath. Not of relief, but of recognition. Walter watched from the side. Unmoving. His gaze shifting between the Marines and the space they were learning to read. And there was no need for him to step in. No need to correct or guide. Because what had been shown had already taken hold. Not as instruction, but as experience. And that kind of learning did not require reinforcement. Mercer turned slightly, looking toward Walter. And for a moment the distance between them felt different. No longer defined by rank or role, but by something quieter. Something closer to respect. And he nodded once. A simple gesture, but one that carried acknowledgement without the need for words. Walter returned the nod just as simply. Not as acceptance. Not as agreement. But as recognition. And then his gaze drifted back to the horizon. To the wind that continued to move whether anyone watched it or not. To the patterns that existed whether they were understood or ignored. The Marines continued their work. Each shot now part of a process rather than a test. Each adjustment informed by observation rather than reaction. And the range itself seemed to open up, not changing, but revealing more of what had always been there. Mercer took a slow breath, then spoke. His voice calm, steady. That is enough for today. And the words did not carry finality. They carried continuation. The sense that what had begun here would extend beyond this moment. Beyond this range. The Marines stood, clearing their positions with the same discipline as before, but with a different awareness. Their movements more deliberate. Their attention lingering on the space around them as if seeing it for the first time. And as they stepped back, a few of them glanced toward Walter. Not out of curiosity, but out of respect. The kind that is not given lightly, and never forced. Walter turned slightly, preparing to leave as quietly as he had arrived. His presence already receding into the background. But before he stepped away, Mercer's voice reached him one last time. Softer now. You ever coming back? He asked. Not as an order. Not as a request. But as something in between. Walter paused. Just for a moment. Then gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug, his eyes still on the horizon. The wind is always here.